It's no secret that I have been influenced by your comments every now and then. After all, the whole interest in split keyboards came to be as such, and so did the latest acquisition, the MoErgo Go60. When I first looked it up, I couldn't believe that I somehow missed its release. Granted, I don't spend as much time on social media as I used to, but still. Glancing at it through the screen and seeing those big circular touchpads, I couldn't help myself but utter, well, hello there. Full disclosure, just like the ZSA Voyager, the Go60 was sent to me by the company that makes them, MoErgo in this case. They did so very kindly after I asked them for a review unit, but just like with the Voyager before, they did not read nor see any of this beforehand. This literary catastrophe is of my own creation, and the only ones to judge it will be you. With that out of the way, let's go. 60. It's going to be hard for me not to compare this to the Voyager, so I won't. Both are fairly similar in their initial impressions, but the closer I looked, the more different they got, with each having their own sets of strengths and weaknesses. Upon holding the Go60 for the first time, I immediately felt the slightly less rigid, less dense exterior compared to the Voyager, and thus, dare I say it, a less premium feel. The all-black enclosure from the Voyager and the subtle rubber edges, as well as other smaller details, all help in conveying that. But if you consider that the Go60 starts at $315, which is about $50 less than the Voyager, and includes the touchpads, the value proposition starts to shift a little. There's some pushback though, because if you consider getting the optional palm rest, which will add another $128 to the bill, it's getting closer again. But in my opinion, the palm rest isn't optional. It's a must, and that's coming from somebody who doesn't even like palm or wrist rest all that much. I've had quite a few different cushion crushes over the years, but never ended up staying together with one long term. Granted, this is the first time I am dating twins with a couch, so maybe this newfound glory isn't all that special. Regardless, there's something almost divine about how it feels to just rest your entire hands on these slightly angled semi-book matched pieces of walnut. As an enthusiast of another finger acrobatic hobby which revolves around wood, that is the electric guitar, this felt especially nice. The finish is just beautiful, but even more so comfortable, and I was missing it whenever I didn't have it with me. Which is more often than I would have liked, as its size made it less ideal to daily commute with. The Go60 itself, though, is a different story. It just about matches the Voyager's dimensions with the navigator attached, and includes a very interesting transport method. At first, I was questioning this cheese-colored donut contraption, but quickly began to appreciate the very compact and consistent size of it. The halves essentially rest caps first against each other, with about a millimeter to spare between them, which luckily is just about enough for the slightly taller KLP lame caps that I fitted my unit with. Well, almost. As they say in the biz, the tips unfortunately touch. And yes, I attempted to hand label these because even after a year on splits, my brain sometimes still can't remember a squat. Back to the original caps. I didn't replace them because I had any issues with them, on the contrary. I was actually surprised once again, this time by the softer than usual feel due to them being made of palm instead of PBT or ABS, which I'm more familiar with. I don't think I ever had palm keycaps, however, this isn't a new invention either. There's a little write-up on MoErgo's website regarding the backstory and details on the longevity, which I've linked down below if you're interested. If there's one thing I could fault the keycaps for, is that they only exist in a white version. Well, technically MoErgo does offer alternatives, but regardless of the board color, white is what you will get by default. However, this has, as I have learned, also reason, because they aren't actually white, slightly translucent. This is to let the RGB and LED indicators for the layers, Bluetooth profiles and other features to shine through. MoErgo also says that this is the reason for the lettering to be not as sharp as it could be. However, I've actually seen much worse on completely normal PPT keycaps, so I think they're pretty good on that front. The same goes for the leveling, which is spot on. While we're at it, let's talk switches, which, surprise, surprise, surprised me too. After my Voyager review, I got quite a few recommendations for the ambient silent chalk switches. Unfortunately, I ended up not really liking them and reverted back to the sunsets, which are tactile switches. However, ordering the Go60, I felt compelled to try another silent chalk variant, in particular the cherry blossoms, which they've designed in collaboration with Kale, and I gotta tell you, these feel phenomenal. If you still want something different though, the board is of course hot swappable, but there's more, it's also Choc V2 compatible. If you're less familiar with this, Choc V1s are pretty common low-profile switches that look like little Bombermen. Most often you'll see these and Gator and low-profile switches, which look like this. There's of course even more variations out there, but rising in popularity, especially in splits, are the aforementioned Choc V2s, which the Go60 is fully compatible with, and thus opens up the door for a vast selection of fun switches and keycaps, with some caveats though. Because of the Choc spacing, you can't just slap any old Amex keycaps on here, even though the stem is compatible now. Except maybe the thumb cluster, where I fitted silent tactile Choc V2s and fitted my Amex spaced lames for some giggles. I suppose a little blasphemy doesn't hurt. Speaking of the thumb clusters, let's talk about the layout, which is, as the name suggests, consistent of 60 keys, and that's 60 exactly, I might add. This is even more than on the Voyager, where after using 40% keyboards for so long, I struggled to figure out what to do with all the extras. Deja vu is all I have to say here, and is something which I will likely repeat again in a month's time on the next video. The additions are mostly contained in the bottom row, where I actually appreciate them the most. For one, we have full-on 3 thumb keys like on a Korn, and if you want to push it, technically 4 or even 5 keys that are easily accessible by the big stubby as well. I've selected specific keycaps down there to make sure I know where the limit is and how far my thumb is allowed to wander, and until now at least it has worked out pretty well. Wandering around the exterior some more, we have the individual power buttons, labeled in white as well. Uniformity desires aside, I can appreciate the contrasting color choice as it makes spotting them much more easy. They have a very satisfying long click, and each off just takes a few seconds before the pairing is completed. Oh, did I mention that the Go60 is wireless? Yeah, that's a pretty big deal to me, a very big deal. A very long one too. The battery life, that is. I've received my Go60 on the 18th of February and have used it in wireless mode for almost every day at work and later at home to print out the previews and this video. At the time of recording this voiceover, which is about 3.5 weeks in, I'm at 14%. This is especially impressive if you consider that there's almost no noticeable wake time on the Go60. Certain keyboards take a few seconds to connect with your computer. Not this one though. It has always been immediate. Of course, you can also operate the Go60 in wired mode with a classic USB cable on the left and a TRRS cable connecting each half. This configuration will also charge both halves at the same time. And when you plug and unplug the cable, you're actually dynamically switching between wired and wireless mode, which is pretty cool. Before we get to the touchpads, let's wrap the hardware impressions by looking at tenting. A feature found on pretty much every split keyboard, I believe, in one shape or another. The implementation of which will always vary depending on the make and model, and for my limited Ergo split run, the Go60 possesses one of the most adjustable options so far. Well, technically the Naya Create has more choices as it's fully adjustable, but in terms of rigid variants, this takes the cake. Like others, it uses magnets to attach the tenting poles to prop up the center of each half in order to create a more natural typing position. Here too, I was a bit hesitant at first, questioning the stability as well as the ease of use. Initially, the choice of using screws to make adjustments left a rather fiddly impression on me. But I only changed it once after reaching my desired angle, and thus I ended up appreciating the freedom of choice I was given. I will say though that in its tallest form there does exist the risk of collapse, but this I think isn't a real world scenario, unless you type with the force of 1,000 angry comments. If you're wondering what happens to the wrist rest if you go tenting, well, it too shipped with dedicated poles, and you may prop it up just the same. And if you're on the move a lot, don't fret, the carrying donut has you covered, as strapping in the tenting feet was a simple and effective solution. While we're on the subject of tenting, MoErgo also sent me the mounting pucks for the Go60. These are magnetically attachable 1/4 inch threads that you can attach to get the keyboard into a more exotic position. If you're new to splits, this is a common practice to go beyond the physical confinements of tenting feet. And I was pleasantly surprised by the feel of it after mounting it to my chair, which I will say was only possible due to the wireless nature of the board. This was done using 2 small rig magic arms and super clamps, common camera rigging gear you can find on Amazon. I'll briefly talk about this at the very end of this video. For now, I think it's time to finally get to the touch point of the Go60. Let's get the elephant out of the room first here. The touchpads on the Go60 aren't going to replace a magic trackpad. But like the ball on the Voyager, it does open up a level of convenience that's hard to ignore, especially after it has been set up properly. The fact that there are two also adds an additional layer of flexibility, if not a sense of serenity, as symmetry has been fully restored. Let's rewind a little bit first though. Like I alluded to in my Voyager video, I do enjoy the close proximity of a pointer device that I may reach without much movement. And this is true for the Go60 as well, with the right touchpad acting as your primary cursor and the left one as your scroll wheel. This is super convenient and allows me to do two things at the same time. Finally, years of DualShock practice is paying off. Arousing stick flicking skills aside, this was and truly is pretty fun to use. Let me give you a real-world example. It allows me to instantaneously scroll horizontally on my timeline in DaVinci Resolve, my editing software of choice. And because the left hand tends to rest permanently on the keyboard, it actually sped up a portion of my workflow. The same goes for navigating a canvas, where this works not only horizontally but also vertically or diagonally. I really cannot emphasize the flexibility, especially if you use a graphic tablet like myself, where you don't have a dedicated scroll wheel, at least not on a pen. This means I don't have to put down or move any of my hands anywhere. I can do everything now. I also feel like it was quicker to familiarize myself with than the Navigator, which is the trackball attachment of the Voyager. However, there are a few nitpicks I have too. One is the limited surface area, which I'll get to in a second. The other is the orientation of the touchpads, because they are slightly angled. If you look closely, there are these little dimples which basically point to which direction is up and down. Now, this is neat, but my hands didn't align with this out of the gate. I was about 10 degrees off most of the time and only realized when the scrolling behavior kept changing speeds, because I would cross between horizontal and vertical streams, and as one knows, you don't cross the streams, or swords. Once my muscle memory kicked in though, it was a slip and slide from there on out. Well, almost. You see, sometimes size does matter, and considering that I frequently use my 11 inches, iPad Pro's touchpad, it wasn't because I wasn't used to something small. The issue I'm talking about isn't a Go60 issue, it's an Apple issue. Let me explain. On macOS, scrolling, especially on the Magic Trackpads, is handled with this fluid elastic motion. Meaning if you flick, it'll just go and bounce around. This helps a lot, especially if your surface area is small. By default though, third-party touchpads don't do this and immediately stop when you lift your finger. Luckily there's help. After almost writing off the touchpad for scrolling, I came across an open source app called Moz, which works fantastically well in recreating this behavior. I don't know how this is on Windows or Linux, but if you're looking to get this working on macOS, this is a good option. Something I couldn't find a software fix for though is the slipperiness of the touchpad. Coming from an Apple Magic Trackpad again, both in integrated and external form, I am used to one heck of a smooth ride, which the touchpad of the Go60 simply cannot match. As soon as my hands are a tiny bit wet, don't ask, I get practically stuck. Ironically, the surface area besides the trackpad feels actually smoother to glide across. As the sweaty season inches closer, not nearly fast enough, I am curious how these will fare with the clammy hands that I have. For comparison, I think the Naya Crate does this a little better, and so does the trackpad attachment of the ultimate hacking keyboard, even though it's even tinier. ZSA has teased one too for the Voyager, so here's hoping they can avoid this as well. Something I think the trackball does way better though is how it deals with dragging or holding. With such limited surface area, it doesn't take long before you run out of real estate, which can be cumbersome, for example, if you're in the middle of moving a file around. The trackpad does have a functionality called Glide Extend, which basically holds on to whatever you are clicking while you go past the edge. It's neat and it did save me a couple of times. I still think a carefree flick on a trackball is easier though. With all of this being said, I may have sounded a little negative on the touchpads of the Go60, but I assure you I actually like them a lot. I truly think keyboards with integrated pointers are the way to go for me. They just add a layer of navigation that's hard to pass on once you've experienced it. Compared to trackballs, these can be used pretty much anywhere without the fear of losing your marbles. Speaking of insane, let's talk software. Configuring the Go60 goes much of the same way as it did for the Voyager, but just like before, the differences lie in the details. The most immediate one to me was how the actual update process is being conducted. We once again don't have the ability to test out the changes live, although there is a swanky interface, even with customizable themes. But just like on the Voyager, the actual update has to be done manually, even more so to be honest, as your config will have to be compiled, downloaded and then transferred to the board. You do this by turning it off, plugging it in, holding down the first thumb key from the outside and the third key from both axes and then turning the board back on. This will result in an external drive popping up in your system, which you then can just drag the new firmware file onto. It'll then trigger the automated update process, which finishes by violently ejecting itself to the absolute horror of your operating system. If you've built a split keyboard yourself, you might be familiar with this process. The board source Unicorn, for example, updates very similarly. It's a little less refined than I would have liked, but surprisingly ignorable after a while, with remembering which keys to press down being the tricky part. Personally, I added a little help to assist my aging brain. This process isn't hard, it's actually super easy, but I'd be lying if I said this didn't annoy me at the beginning, especially while I was still familiarizing myself with the layout and wanted to make frequent changes. I hope one day we get ZMK boards that update just the same way as QMK ones do, instantaneously. So yes, the Go60 runs ZMK and can be configured using MoErgo's custom editor, which can be accessed via the web. Your starting point is a base layer, either one by MoErgo or a community one. I chose one called macOS Default, which resulted in something I always love about boards like these. You see, as basic as my preferred layout is, I still like to see what other people or companies come up with. For example, I have been very vocal about my arrow key preferences, keeping them under my right hand on a second layer. The default macOS layout on the Go60 moves these to the left hand, which I at first completely dismissed and remapped. So when I started using the board, the touchpad taught me to rely more on my left hand. And then it hit me. If I move the arrow keys too, the right hand is forever freed up from doing anything but the cursor movement. I love the fact that my layout keeps evolving with every keyboard I get, simply because I either have to make it work, or in this case, it teaches me a new way. There's much more to this than the editor, of course. But I can't cover every detail in a reasonable amount of time, so let's go through some of the highlights that stuck with me. Let's use one of my favorite functions which I've recently discovered: tapping to get one key and holding to get another one. On Oryx, the editor for the ZSA Voyager, you can simply select which key on your layout you would like to modify and then assign the respective character or function to the command. Here you have to select a type first. In this case it's called Mod Tab. You can then select which two characters you want to trigger depending on tapping or holding. Both approaches work great, but I wish I could do this with mouse clicks as well, as in Mod Tab the selection is currently limited to regular keys, unlike in Oryx, where you can assign pretty much anything, anywhere. I wanted this because I had the idea for one of the thumb keys to act as my left click on tab and right click when holding. Now, this is indeed not possible with Mod Tab, but it isn't impossible overall. There's a really cool feature called Custom Defined Behaviors, which allows me to add custom code to achieve exactly that. It's not as user-friendly as going through the UI, but it works great once I figured out how to write it. And by how, I mean I asked Claude to do it for me and then just copy-pasted the code into the field. I do believe that Mod Tab and also Layer Tab are more standardized terms when it comes to ZMK, meaning if you're familiar with this, you'll be right at home, unlike me. Another really interesting feature is the mouse emulation, which lets you intercept mouse events to then translate or modify them. One such example is the temporary layer, meaning you can have a layer activated whenever you move the mouse. If you've watched my Voyager video, you'll know that this is exactly how the navigator trackball attachment works. Since it doesn't have any physical buttons, it'll activate a layer where some of the keyboard keys become the mouse buttons. So in order to get the right click, you could use this function to trigger a layer with mouse buttons as soon as you touch the trackpad, and deactivates itself again after a little delay. You can also chain these to do quite a few crazy things, like invert the scrolling behavior depending on certain conditions, or reassign mouse clicks to keyboard keys and much more. The extensive level of customization is quite impressive here and showcases one of the biggest differences I felt during my use of the Go60 compared to the Voyager. There's a very big asterisk though. You can do all of this with the Voyager too, they're both highly configurable, it's just a matter of how. A more differentiating feature though is the mobile friendliness of the editor. If you ever had a configuration epiphany during a commute, MoErgo has you covered as the editor is fully responsive. What's not available per default is per-key RGB customization, at least not as a stock function. There are ways to get this working though. Initially I was a tiny bit confused because the UI does let you assign colors, but this is for orientation purposes and doesn't apply to the actual board. Another interesting feature is localization or layout localization. This I found very intriguing. It's not something I'm likely to ever use, but it's also not something I've come across before. Essentially, you can configure your board to your heart's content and then see how it will fare if you plug it into a machine that has a different locale. If you're working in an environment where you have very tight restrictions on what you can change on your computer, this might actually come in very handy. Finally, there's custom device tree definitions, which will override default ZMK behaviors as far as I understand, which I don't. There's also some more advanced configuration options I won't go into more detail as this video is already way too long. There's probably nobody left watching anyway, which means I can throw in an awful joke that nobody will ever know about. Why did the Hold tab break up with the mod Morph? It said, I need someone who doesn't change when I apply pressure. I loved the Voyager, unsurprisingly considering its popularity, meaning the Go60 entered the ring having to face a tough competitor right off the heels of a big win. Yet I was continually surprised by how well it did in said ring, and I can see how many, including myself, are potentially pondering between these two. However, apart from the form factor, nearly every other detail about these two is different. For me, the Go60's initial quirkiness turned out to add so much to its charm and unique approach, whether that is the choice of dual touchpads or having Chalk V1 and 2s as an option. But the most striking one of all to me is the optional palm rest. Yes, you can 3D print a similar support system for the Voyager, but the wood finish adds a level of natural comfort that's otherwise just not obtainable. Then there's the wireless functionality. This is something I longed for a while now, and I was prepared to fight some quirky behavior. But to my surprise again, it's been rock solid and never dropped while I was using it. Equally impressive to me is the battery life. I'm still running on the first charge and it has wholly convinced me to leave the house without any anxiety. Battery anxiety, that is. The other one is omnipresent. This might sound benign, but it isn't always the case with other boards like these or similar. Battery has always been an issue. It also allowed me to finally try out a typing method I was always curious about. Back in the day when I was a maturing cheese somewhere in a wet cave, I watched the movie Grandma's Boy. Ever since, I dreamed of the day where I could utter one of the most quotable lines ever. I'm thinking of getting metal legs. It's a risky operation, but it'll be worth it. Of course, I'm not going to chop off my walking sticks, but sitting in my chair and controlling my computer entirely with the keys and touchpad made me reminisce about this odd but strangely befitting scene. Over the course of the last months, I've really grown to appreciate the touchpads or trackpads, whether that is because of the convenience of having no moving parts, which makes transportation effortless, or the fact that the combination of scroll and pointer is something I didn't know I'd love this much. If I had one wish though, it would be multi-touch. I know the Naya does this, although it's been a while since I've used the board as it's still broken, so I can't make a fair comparison. But every now and then, whenever I use my magic trackpad, I do get reminded of how convenient this addition could be. The Go60 is a strikingly complete feeling product. Yes, some experiences could use a bit more polish, but to no extent did I find any part of it lacking to the point where I couldn't recommend it. The biggest question remains though, one I ask myself nearly every morning as I pack my bags for work. Which one will I take with me after this video is done? Will it still be the Go60, or will I revert back to the Voyager? Luckily, that decision is off my hands, because the answer is the ultimate hacking keyboard, as it's the next video. A cop-out? Most definitely. Thank you so much for watching, it's good to see you. Until next time,